happy to moderate what promises to be a quite informative and educational session with two really important experts and Obama scholar Valeria Kovtun. Am I putting the accent in the right place?
It's an old, yeah, Kovtun.
Kovtun.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to just say something very quickly about format. Try and keep this casual. We have small audience. The format will be that our Professor Tamar will pose some questions and have a conversation, and then afterward we will move to questions from the audience. And before you pose a question, please just introduce yourself. Two quick announcements. So I have a speaker series, and if you want to sign up for more interesting events on the region on Eurasia, please contact Sophia, our student assistant here at Harriman Institute in the master's program. And if you want to sign up for general all and any events that the Harriman Institute puts on during the semester, please just go to our homepage and scroll down. It's called a newsletter, but that will sign you up for announcements. Also, I want to quickly mention that there's an event right after this, or somewhat overlapping at 6:30 p.m. No, so after this event, Signals of Being, a play in 3 acts, a play by Volodymyr Rafaenko, the Ukrainian writer, and translated by our own professor of Ukrainian language and literature, Mark Andruchik. And that is taking place where? Right here?
There's actually, the reception starts right outside at 6.
Oh, you
So the event starts at 6. So we figure we'll let you know because you're gonna be walking through anyway. It's another Ukrainian event, so you're welcome.
Okay.
Come by. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now I will just give you the bios of our two speakers, starting with Kovtun Valeria. She has worked in more than a decade advancing media education, shaping strategies against disinformation, and leveraging technology to safeguard societies from authoritarian threats. First, she worked in a job at the BBC in London, and after exiting that job, she launched Ukraine's first governmental media literacy program by the name of Filter. Yeah, so she's the founder and director of Filter, which designed and implemented public interventions reaching millions of Ukrainians daily, building resilience against disinformation at one of the most critical moments in the country's history. In addition, she has served as an advisor to UNDP, IREX, OSCE, Radio Free Europe, British Council, and Zinc Network, advising on designing national programs for countering information threats at scale. Most recently, she has led strategic partnerships at OpenMinds in London, delivering threat intelligence and response services to more than 30 governments and organizations. Her work has focused on helping European and US partners understand and respond to information threats, in particular in contested and hard to access environments. In terms of her educational specialization and degrees, she holds an MSc from London School of Economics and fellowships from Chevening and the UN. And she was selected as an Obama scholar, so they're doing the right thing over there in that program, where she has been exploring arts and innovation and how they can be leveraged to strengthen democracies and build societal resilience worldwide. So welcome. We're very happy to have you here and to hear about your really interesting experience and expertise. And we're also happy to welcome Professor Tamar, who is an associate professor at SIPA and a faculty member at Columbia's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, also a faculty member at the Institute of Global Politics at SIPA and the Data Science Institute. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology and international politics. She studies how state and non-state actors strategically use media to influence public behavior in democracies and non-democratic contexts. Also, how conflicts are shaped by emerging technologies, and the role of identity in political violence and nonviolent activism. Her articles have been published in top journals, and I want to mention her new book entitled Safe Havens for Hate: The Challenge of Moderating Online Extremism, which just came out with Princeton University Press last year. And it explains why militant and hate organizations flourish online despite global efforts to clamp down on harmful content on social media platforms. So incredibly timely, and we look forward to sharing her expertise with you today as well. So thanks for coming, and let's get started.
Great. So thanks so much for the introductions. And I would just say that I'm so delighted to have Valeria here with me. In fact, we've been in touch long before this meeting. She's been we're doing some really interesting work here at Columbia this year related to the Obama Scholarship. Maybe we'll get to it at some point. But I did want to say that when I got to know her and her work, I was so impressed by the hands-on experience she's been having on the same things I study as an academic. So I think it's a really fun opportunity for us to engage on some of the issues we discussed one-on-one. And specifically, the goal of today and kind of the focus, and we can expand it to related themes if you want, but kind of one thing that we found really interesting to focus on today is this role of information in ongoing military conflicts. And unfortunately, we have many around the world that we can point to, and we'll discuss some of them today. And what's interesting, if you look at the trends around the use of information or the strategic use of information in conflict, is that there's a lot more that is happening today that seem to matter for the way the conflicts unfold or the way the public understands them. And as a result, we see more efforts by different actors involved in these conflicts to shape public opinion in strategic ways that could advantage the efforts of the war. So we really wanted to kind of focus on this particular role of information in the context of conflict and thinking about different parts of it, and particularly when information turns into disinformation, how could societies combat it? So Valeria, actually, you have personally experienced this sort of strategic role of information at the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and specifically with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So I wanted to ask if you can start by just describing to us some of the kind of firsthand experience you had with this combat over information and narratives, and how it played out as you were kind of in the trenches in Ukraine at the time.
Yeah, I think one important factor is that in 2021, when I just was launching the National Media Literacy Program in Ukraine, we thought that the first step would be to raise awareness about why media literacy should matter to people, because when we analyzed the landscape of the whole work around media literacy in Ukraine, we figured that a lot has been done, but it mainly stayed within the same bubble, the expert bubble, mainly educational environments. And if we wanted the publics to understand why they had to be more critical with the information they consume, we realized we had to go to different individuals and tell them, this is how you can use it in your daily life. If you're a mother, this is how this information will be helpful for you to help your kids decide about your future. If you are someone who's doing business, this is how the information can be helpful for you to understand how to make the right decision. So we had to figure out what would be the greatest tailored solutions. And we also worked a lot with the media to help them understand why it was interesting and important to sell media literacy to all the audiences. I use sell, but in fact, when I talk to journalists and I told them, why don't you do much more around, how information consumption changed people's lives, they would be telling to me, people are not buying that. Audiences don't want that. There's no demand for it. But what happened in 2022 in February, I call it a watershed moment, because that's when people realized that the war was happening on the ground. Because if the war is not there and you don't see tanks and you don't see the actual, traditional images of the war, it's really hard to think that you have some threats attacking you in the information environment. When you figure out in your personal experience that information can help you survive, can help you make the right choice in the right moment, you start being excited about the idea of learning more about it. So this is what happened in the first few weeks of the invasion. And if you look at the Ukrainian information environment, you would see that we had the National Marathon, which was the united TV channel speaking as one, because that was the governmental decision, so that people wouldn't be flooded with different sources of information. They just could go to the one, which was, I think, the right decision for the time of the invasion. Questionable whether we still need it now. But what was happening at the local level, it was a full chaos and a lack of local journalism, lack of verified, trustworthy sources of information. And that's where most of the war, like battlefield, was unfolding. And given that I was in Kiev on the first day of the invasion, but then I moved back to the frontline region where my hometown is, I could see a big difference between what the national media was reporting and what was happening on the ground, because every single minute or every 20 minutes, something was changing. The tanks were moving, there were Russian checkpoints in different locations. And for people to understand what they should do and how they should keep their families safe, it was paramount to understand where these checkpoints were, how they were moving, and where it was safe to go, where it wasn't. And given that there is not enough food supplies, people actually struggling to survive, when you don't have the basic information about what's safe, what's not, you start panicking. And in that chaos, in that vacuum of information, Russia was very, I think, skillful in terms of flooding that space with its information, and generated Telegram channels that would call themselves by the names of the towns and would report as if Russia had already occupied this town, which wasn't the case. So when I looked back at the time, I realized how many fake channels were there. And because Ukrainians were in such demand for truthful, verified information, they would stick to anything that sounded familiar. And when they saw the name of their hometown on that channel, it sounded familiar. And they wouldn't be obviously Russian. You wouldn't say, oh, that's clear, it's a Russian propaganda. They usually would mix some facts with some narratives around Russians coming as saviors. And that is the most tricky part, because when there's no local journalist telling you this is exactly the truth and you're clinging to anything that can save your life, you would read even the pro-Russian Telegram channels if they give you some sort of facts and some sort of reality check.
This is so fascinating, especially because on one hand, there's like two things going on. On one hand, you have a growing demand for information, any information in a context of a highly volatile situation where it's not clear like what is happening in your town or in your neighboring town. And in parallel, you have, I guess, a state actor like Russia or Russian operatives that know that there is a demand for this information and then tailor the information to kind of meet the demand. Do you remember having was this information kind of immediate, like happening as the demand was unfolding, or was it kind of, I'm just curious to think about like how, Russia from its side was trying to, affect Ukrainians in the midst of this.
So the thing is that they had, I wrote it down because there were 86 bot farms that Ukrainian intelligence service detected in the first few days of the invasion. And they operated with 3 million fake accounts that is targeting around 12 million people. And this is only on Telegram. So apparently the infrastructure had already been there and it was prepared for the time when the actual invasion starts. But also, I think Russia is flooding the information space. They call it a fire horse of falsehoods. It's not a new information, but it actually is the case. And we had so many absolutely random stories popping up in different messengers. But the worst is when people are panicking and they're already emotionally charged, they pick it up themselves and they amplify that information unknowingly. So we had a lot of Ukrainians in those smaller towns who were just panicking. And when they saw something around, Russia would come up with some stories about betrayal inside of the local administration, and then people would search for those people who are actually, working with Russia, and just kind of trying to find enemies within. And these are the stories that might have appeared through Russia's campaigns, but in fact, Ukrainians themselves would amplify it. So I think it works a lot super well with the fear that's already in the society. In fact, I think Ukrainian government did a great job in terms of reporting on what was happening. And we had a great infrastructure ourselves with the civil society, fact-checking organizations who would be working nonstop to inform Ukrainians of how these tactics were unfolding on the ground. But again, this is something I saw happening better after a few days of the invasion. The first few days, it was a huge panic. Everyone was trying to do something, but it was not super coordinated. And that's when I think the disinformation has the most effect, in those moments of tension, lack of certainty. And I clearly could see it affecting the people around me, even in my family, when you like one message from one Telegram channel says you should flee because it's going to get worse. And given that we already started seeing stories from Mariupol where people were tortured, of course you get affected by that. And if you think of a potential future like that for you and your family, you rather flee. But then the next minute, there's another Telegram channel from the authorities saying that you better stay because the checkpoints are moving. So you might come across Russians who might treat you no one knows how. So balancing that and making a decision, especially if a decision is related to not your personal life, but also to the life of the people who surround you, it creates a lot of internal struggle. Mm-hmm. And when the future is unclear, this is when I think you can easily manipulate people's decisions.
Mm-hmm. This is really interesting. And I think it speaks to the current information environment we live in, where information does flow within a matter of seconds. We have maybe less of an opportunity for a countermeasure, like the government saying, no, this is not truthful, to reach the people in real time. And I think that this is something that is happening. And I can document very similar examples that happened actually in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in 2021. I studied this context a few years ago, and saw exactly the same pattern. So before the group was taking over an area, a town, they would coordinate messaging to reach the population in a given town before they were there, creating an illusion that they're actually already there, already controlling the village, the town, or even the district. And I think the idea behind that case, as far as I can tell, was to basically demobilize people from resisting. So the idea is like, if you're already there, I better flee or just surrender and not even think about, doing something that might risk my life. And I think that your example, in my opinion, kind of speaks to this really interesting dimension when we think about information flows and where are the vulnerabilities. I think it seems to suggest that it's clearly when there is no clear knowledge of what is truth. And we'll talk more about kind of how this may unfold in, as we have more automated ways to create images of reality through AI. We'll get to this later on. But I think this is quite fascinating. So kind of moving on from there, we already alluded to this. I think that what these examples suggest that there is really important influence for uncertainty. So when there is uncertainty, when people don't know what is happening in a given point in time, that could increase actors' interest in shaping what people believe is happening. So do you have some, you already gave some examples, but some additional examples, maybe from later in the war or even the first few days of the war, or really any examples you may have on how Russia has tried to use uncertainty of this sort to influence the Ukrainian public to maybe behave in a way that will be advantageous for Russia in that context?
Well, I wanted to add to the previous point as well, is that I don't think they know for sure what will work. And the thing is that if you look at all the leaked documents from the social design agency, they usually don't measure it the way we like to measure impact.
Yeah.
They just measure it in volumes and engagement. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it changes people's behaviors. So they made mistakes as well, but they also learn, what resonates, what doesn't. So one of the examples was when Ukraine deoccupied some of the areas, they found methodички, which is guidelines of Kremlin that some of the Russians left in those areas. And they completely removed the narratives about Russians as Ukrainian brothers, because that was a very prevalent narrative that they used before the invasion, portraying Ukraine as a younger brother of Russia and all this brotherhood of nations, and Russia is only wanting the best for Ukraine. So they removed that, and instead there were a clear guideline: do not talk about it, but rather say Ukrainian leadership has abandoned you. You would ask people in this area, where's Ukrainian police? Where are Ukrainian soldiers? You see, there's no one here, and there's only Russian soldiers coming to help you. So that was a change that I think they also kind of figured works better in those areas, because clearly when Ukrainians saw Russian tanks, it's unusual that your brother would come and want to take your territory or kill you. So they also shape it and change it. But the thing is that I don't think they are super. Like they don't double down much on behavioral science, and they don't check the psychology much, even though on Telegram it's an open source. So we detected some of the recommendations that Russians were sharing between each other on how to promote a fake story in Ukraine. And basically they say, just repeat it as often as you can, come up with something simple, leave some space for human imagination, use some local details so it's more believable. So it's not a rocket science. It's really the simplest marketing tools that people use to persuade people and to spread some messages around. And I think what works really well is this volume and this sense of uncertainty, as you said. And throughout throughout the war, there are moments when there's either a conflict happening between the leadership, Zaluzhny, Zelensky, when there is lack of information coming from the government, and that's the worst, when the strategic communications in the country don't work as well, and there's already a distrust towards leadership. That's what they weaponize most. And also, they don't need to come up with something extremely new. They just weaponize the existing tensions in the Ukrainian society, in the Western democratic societies. And for example, mobilization, conscription is a tension point in Ukrainian society. So if there is something that happened and it's documented, they would amplify it. They would cut this video into different segments, and then they would spread it to different platforms, and then they would find some pseudo experts commenting on that case. So this is how it works. And I mean, now as I'm spending a lot of time at Columbia, I stopped looking at disinformation as a standalone problem, but rather as a tip of the iceberg, because they usually take advantage of the cracks that already exist in the society. And one of the interesting points for me, and it's really, sometimes it makes me feel uneasy when I realize that Russia weaponizes the problems that we have in the West, like the migration crisis in Europe. They fueled far-right movements in Germany, specifically pointing at that migration crisis. But what's happening inside of Russia is much worse. And there's so much hate towards ethnic minorities, towards migrants that come to the country. But we don't really look at it as, their tension points. So it's asymmetry by default, and we always have to be in a defensive position. But what I realized worked, at least in the Ukrainian context, is that when people know who they are and they feel confident about that there's something to defend, it's much harder to break their morale, no matter how many fake stories you come up with. So we doubled down on Ukrainian identity, and in the first months of the invasion, we saw a lot of excitement around learning more about Ukrainian history, identity, some of the archives that were not publicized before. So together with the work on media literacy and fact-checking, we were actually producing a lot of stories in different formats, from podcasts to TikTok videos about Ukraine, regional differences, Ukrainian history, culture, music, films, Ukrainian poets that were lesser known. And I felt like that boosted morale much more than any fact-checking work that we could have done.
Thank you for sharing this. So picking up on this sort of, what could be done. So like, on one hand, it sounds like it would be definitely smart to understand what an actor like Russia in this context would try to do and what are the tactics that they're using. And you already started giving some examples of the countermeasures that Ukraine has took to kind of stop that influence. And you've been really involved in this, of course, with the work you've done. Could you tell us a bit more on, what exactly this sort of media literacy, looked like? You mentioned that in kind of contrasted with like morale boosting campaigns. So could you tell us a bit more like how does a country that is attacked with disinformation during an ongoing conflict, kind of how does it start kind of stopping that influence, or at least try to stop the influence, maybe sharing some from your work that you've done.
So yeah, I don't think media literacy can do that at all. I think it's one of the solutions, and for us, it's also difficult to measure it, because if you look at the long term, it's really difficult to attribute that this is exactly the training that we did. This helped Ukrainians become more, resilient to disinformation. But in fact, I think what worked as a governmental program, we were not aiming at building some silver bullet approach that everyone would use when the crisis situation arises. We were aiming at making it available, the solutions that already existed, and maybe boosting some of the key players in the field so that they can scale. And the idea was to firstly make it easy for Ukrainians to access the best tools, the best resources that were already out there. So even in 2021, we worked a lot on building a platform that would unify all the solutions and would be really user-friendly, so that if you are a parent or you're a journalist or you're a teacher, you'd go to the one platform, you make 1 or 2 clicks maximum, and these are all the resources that you can find helpful. And then if we build some campaigns and we want to run it on the national level, we always have a call to action, which would be that platform. So no matter what we were doing, whether it's a national media literacy test, a national unity lesson, we would always have that link embedded in the whole campaign, so that people, if they find it interesting, they can always go to one place. Because of overload, and in general, we have this cognitive burden on daily basis, and especially if we are flooded with so many different types of news, we better have just one step that we make in order to access that information. So we worked a lot with that. But what I found most inspiring and motivating, especially in the first months of the invasion, is that sense of unity that I think was driving a lot of our decisions. So one day I found myself having an online Zoom call with over 30 stakeholders under rocket attacks. They were all in different shelters around the country, but we were thinking about how we can make a media literacy test a national event, and everyone would be offering their solutions and ideas. And it was a very friendly environment, which I think hard to, replicate these days. But that was, I think, a very fertile ground to drive media literacy in the country at the time of war. So we ended up with quite many national events where media, the same journalists who were telling me that media literacy is not something you can sell, those journalists were reporting on disinformation. And one of the most phenomenal things was the media literacy test that was aired by the National Marathon. So they would air the QR code advertising the national media literacy test, specific time when people could access it, and also people could just scan the QR codes from the screen, from the TV screens, and we reached millions of people in that way. But also local voices, lots of local media outlets were reporting on it, and I think building that trust was paramount. And it's not something that can happen in a day. It didn't happen on the day of the invasion. We started building the trust before the invasion, maybe a year or so before. We talked to journalists. We had unconventional formats where we would invite journalists to have a media brunch. Then we would have some, New Year celebration with the donor environment and international development sector, where we would, discuss some solutions with them. So it's all very relationship based. So in the crisis, when you have the trust, I think it works out much better. And then it's also, we got some businesses involved, which was something completely unthinkable in 2021. But in 2022, businesses wanted to do something for the Ukrainian society. And the most phenomenal thing is that our social media were flooded with requests from completely unrelated to the field Ukrainians asking us what can they do. So mobilizing that force and giving them one sort of outlet was paramount. And we decided that every day we would post some stories with specific tasks for Ukrainians. If you want to support Ukraine on the information front, even though some people don't like the word information front, but back then we were using it, we would say, this is what you should do, A, B, C. So super easy. And even some women in the late 60s, 70s who didn't even know what Twitter was suddenly were like, how can I text Boris Johnson? So that was a very, very fulfilling moment for all of us. And I think we took a lot of advantage from that unity and Ukrainians feeling so mobilized.
Thank you. So that sounds to me almost like a combination of all of your efforts together with this sort of rallying around the flag when there is a crisis. And I wanted you to speak to one more example that is not directly related to the beginning of the war, but we discussed before, and I think it relates to some of your work here as an Obama scholar, which is the maze. So this is not directly related to kind of Russian disinformation in the context we just discussed, but it's more of another idea of an effort for engaging people in understanding the importance of verifying information or authoritarian influence more generally. So could you tell us a bit about what you've done in Ukraine? Because I think it was like so and just to give you some context, I met Valeria a few months ago and we discussed an intervention that she's been leading in Ukraine, in certain cities in Ukraine, I think, which was like this really beautiful art exhibit that walked people through some tasks that I would love for you to share a bit, because to me it's like very, very creative way to think about media literacy, or kind of making people aware of potential threats they may not be aware of in this context.
So yeah, this was one of the creative solutions we had and our partners had. The most wonderful thing is that since I'm a former journalist, so I mean, I'm very excited about everything that is not just a textbook. And we had so many media companies coming to us later saying, I have this immersive exhibition, can you support us? IREX was the key driver of this maze, but Filter, the program, we were supporting them in every possible way. The maze is an actual physical construction that is meant to travel throughout Ukraine to different cities, and it would be placed in a public square. And the idea is that people go through the maze, and in the process, they interact with different elements and they learn about how fake works, how can perception be distorted. They learn about some best tools for fact checking. And in the end, once they go through all the rooms, they get a certificate and they kind of feel like they accomplished something. But the idea behind it is that you make it fun. You don't make media literacy as another burden for people. And I mean, honestly, after work, when I spend a lot of time thinking about something strategically, the least thing I want to hear is just do something else, think more. So we wanted people to feel excited about doing it. And also psychology is built the way that if you associate media literacy with a positive result, and like a good mood, then you are more likely to remember it. So it's all emotional. That's how also like the whole disinformation is built on emotions. And when something is emotional, it triggers more attention. So why don't we make media literacy a bit more emotional, and also fun? So the maze would focus on secondary school children, but then also I thought about how we can bring this idea into young people, in particular, young people in the Western democracies who don't fully understand how authoritarianism works, who vote for authoritarian rulers and who think that leadership, a strong leader, can bring them all the solutions that they are hoping to get. So the idea is to show them in their personal experience how disinformation affects them and how it affects their decisions. So, I mean, I believe this is much more efficient. Art evokes so many different memories, so many different emotions in people. And if we tie this emotion to a particular solution, we are more likely to use it eventually.
Yeah, so this is, I really like this example. It's very creative. So moving to a slightly different angle on this. So most of the time when we talk about, disinformation campaigns and societal vulnerability to it, we think about democratic contexts where there's relatively more liberal media environment, more open media environments, and we kind of try to tackle like how do we address this issue, and a lot of the examples you gave I think relate to this context. But we also know that disinformation campaigns of this sort also happen in less open contexts, so in more authoritarian contexts. And I think you have a particular interesting window into this. So part of what you've done in the course of the past few years when you gained expertise on this issue was to also study Russia's domestic information campaigns targeting Russian citizens. So could you tell us a little bit more about that particular case, and what can we learn from it when we think about the role of information in conflict? So not just like country A targeting the population of country B, but also country A targeting its own population, and maybe in a environment that is less open. So how could we study this at all? Like, this is not an easy thing to study, but also what are some findings you can share from what you've done?
Yeah, so it's one of the situations that I keep coming back to was in 2021, I think late December, when I actually looked into Russian news, and I was shocked to see so much about Ukrainian Nazis, and there was so much hostility already there back then. And my first thought was, are we doing something about it? Because we have this huge neighbor near Ukraine who obviously hates Ukraine and doesn't even cover it. It's just publicly available in their media. And back then, the response from the Ukrainians was, well, we better think about our information environment first. We don't have time, we don't have resources to deal with Russians, and they should do it themselves. But in fact, what happened that all this hatred and aggression basically moved into the physical front, and then it becomes irreversible. So it brings me, like, thinking about that moment, I realize now how the similar scenario is being played in Europe or in the Western democracies, where we think we should build our defenses inside of Europe, but we shouldn't look into what's happening in the information environments of authoritarian states, or we shouldn't do anything about it because that's their thing to deal with. But eventually, this thing will cross the borders. And I really believe that if you take a defense position, you're already behind because you are always reactive. And if you are reactive, I mean, if the aggression already crosses borders, you lose lives. At least that's what we've learned in Ukraine. So we did look into Russian information environment, and there is a lot of research available on the website of the company that I worked for. It's really interesting to see how Russian society kind of got to the point where they are in complete denial of reality. And back in 22, I was fascinated to see there were some experiments inside of Russia where they would be shown verified footage, pictures of Ukrainian cities bombed by Russia, with proofs that these are Russian rockets, but their response would still be, how do I trust it? Why do you think I should trust it? And what Russia was doing systematically throughout all these years is that they kill trust to everything. So even if those were highly intellectual Russian elites in Russia, and they would speak English and many other languages, the message they would receive from the Kremlin is, well, you might trust BBC, you might not trust the Russia Today or Russian sources, but how do you know that BBC is not lying to you? How do you know that Western media are fully factual? You cannot know where the truth is. And this lack of belief in anything makes people extremely apathetic. And when they are apathetic, they don't have the agency to say no to something, and they just choose to live their lives and neglect the reality that happens around them. And I feel some similar tendencies already happening in some Western countries, Western democracies, where people just feel overwhelmed by everything that's happening in the world, different politicians driving different ideas, and you don't really know who's the right, who's wrong. For you to know, you'd need to sit down and analyze critically what you believe, what not. And it requires a lot of extra effort. And again, if people are flooded with information on a daily basis, they don't feel incentivized to sit down and analyze and rationalize who's right or wrong. So they usually shut down, and they often prefer not to get involved in politics as much. And I think that's the most dangerous thing. And what I'm seeing a lot about how Europe sees Russia, for example, they help Russian independent media a lot. There are so many, not a lot, but I mean, there are relatively some programs that support the media, and in particular those that are Europe-based. But the question is it working enough? Because if we target the same bubble, the same Russian audience that tends to confirm the same truth that Europeans also believe in, like that Russia is an attacker and Ukraine is defending its sovereignty, and you ignore the 80% of other population who might be apathetic, who might not have this exercise that agency, unlikely this media will change the narrative in the country in general. And the worst thing is that Kremlin propaganda, it just comes from all different sources. And even if people don't watch TV, they still have it somewhere in the background. And as a former journalist, we were always told, if you make a story, make sure the people who might have TV in the background also hear that story. So they might think it's not affecting them, but it is. So unfortunately, this is a very sad situation in Russia, where no matter how hard we might try to bring democratic messages into the country and highlight the facts, they will always be, faced with 90% of Russian propaganda sources from different corners. And whether you want it or not, on a subconscious level, you start finding it familiar. And when you find some information familiar, you're more likely to believe it. So at this point, I'm in a bit, I don't really have a solution. I feel a bit frustrated that we can't really change that much, but maybe someone has, and I'd love to know if someone does.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll talk about this shortly. So I want to move to the next kind of big topic I wanted to discuss before opening it up, which relates to this point you made about how do we know what to believe? And I think that this becomes perhaps even more challenging in our today, the most recent information environment that we're living in, where more and more synthetic content is entering information streams. And I'm talking about generative AI, of course. And this is something that I've been particularly paying attention to in conflicts beyond Russia and Ukraine, and kind of thinking about what is the strategic use of generative AI to kind of achieve these same goals. And one particular example I want to give from my research before I have a couple questions for you is actually on another timely conflict. So the conflict between Iran and Israel. I studied what happened in the information space in the June 2025 escalation, not the current one. Specifically looking at the strategic use of AI-generated media, videos and images. And I can say a lot about this, but one thing I found particularly interesting when looking at engagement with that sort of content is that compared to non-AI generated footage from this round of escalation, the AI generated media gets a lot more engagement online by people. Still open question as to why, but this is something that is pretty systematic from that conflict. And there's other concerns around this. So one is, of course, the idea of deception, that it's impossible to know as this technology evolves faster than we maybe are aware of. It's harder to tell whether a given image that you see has actually happened in the real world. Maybe it's the town that you know that shows something really familiar, but not actually happened in the real world. And the second concern that you also mentioned is this idea of flooding, that it's so easy to generate that sort of information that could be really convincing and flood the information streams with it. So I'm curious to know if you have any specific examples from AI-generated war-related campaigns that you've seen in the context of Russia and Ukraine. I know this is like maybe more recent examples compared to 2022, but I'm curious to hear from you if there's any examples that you can share.
Yeah, a lot actually. Especially on TikTok. In TikTok, we saw so many AI-generated pictures of Ukrainian soldiers back in 2024 already. And recently, it's more about videos. And one of the most recent campaigns was with Ukrainian soldiers who were asking Russians for support and blaming the Ukrainian leadership for wrong decisions. And they look very believable. The only thing is that they have OpenAI Sora watermark on them. But it doesn't stop Ukrainians from believing it, unfortunately. And even not, if I talk about like not Russia-related AI-generated content, on TikTok, there are so many characters that are fully created by AI, and they act as influencers. I think it's a general phenomena in Ukraine in particular. There are so many of them, and so many comments of people saying, "I love your outfits. I like how you act. I like how you sing." And the thing is that some users usually detect and say, "This is AI generated," and they scream about it. And people don't care. They still like to comment on their outfits and their voice and everything. So there's like general AI literacy that I think we need to improve in Ukraine in particular. But yeah, TikTok has been flooded, and usually there are some, they produce it in volumes. Sometimes it works out, and then there are millions of views and many comments. And usually it's the same narrative about betrayal in the army, corruption, Ukraine, the arguments in the Ukrainian government, and also a lot of hate towards Ukrainians who moved abroad, who live abroad now. So they try to fuel that division between Ukrainians who stayed and those who fled. So we see the same themes, but actually the content is becoming more believable. And it's unfortunately, TikTok is not very incentivized to remove it. Once it hit the mark of like 1 million views and hundreds of comments, it's demotivating for them to remove such a viral video from the platform. They claim one thing, but unfortunately, it's not always the same thing they do to safeguard their users from manipulation.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And I'm interested also in the psychological, like, why is this so engaging? And I think there's something, this is just a hunch I have, like, no, I haven't proven it yet, but there's something about, the color usage, the way the characters look like, how they sing, how they act, that is just, kind of really like good at targeting what people want to see. And I think that's another tool in the arsenal. So just to conclude, one final question before we'll open it up for everybody to share their thoughts. You've been doing some really important work in training civil servants on how to detect AI-generated content in Ukraine. So it is becoming harder, but in as much as this could be done, could you share a bit more about this project and how what it aims to do? How could we maybe use this model in other contexts?
So yeah, I was advising, it was just recent, advising a Ukrainian program on supporting the government with the tools and knowledge to detect AI-generated content. And one thing we tried to bring to the civil servants was a suite of tools that actually work. And most of those tools are usually produced in the US. One of the things that I found most challenging was to detect who's actually doing the right thing and who's just doing a great marketing. And unfortunately, there are so many companies that advertise their tools so well, call it battle tested. And when we apply it in real war situations, we realize they don't really work. Or, for example, they have some preconditions that you as a user have to meet in order to verify this information. But in the war realities, you can't have those preconditions. You can't have an original video. It usually comes from different sources, and it can be coming from Telegram, and then it appears on Instagram Reels, and you cannot really detect what's the original source of that video, thus you cannot really verify it. So in this case, the training was super, I think there was a lot of demand because AI is still something mysterious for many Ukrainians, so they want to learn more about it. So we had up to 700 people tuning in from all around the country to participate in the trainings, and we had some practitioners from the field who would talk about the technology of voice cloning and what is the ethical considerations around it. We really see that Ukrainian companies that started their work in 2022, they actually understand the realities on the ground much better. So they tend to tailor their solutions to war-affected countries much better than some countries who haven't really been tested in the battlefields. But I really find it fascinating that despite all these years of war and fatigue and trauma, there's still curiosity around it, and that people are willing to spend 2 days, full days from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. listening to how they can safeguard themselves and their communications from AI-generated content. There's no solution. There is no like one answer where we would say, do this and you'll be safe. But at least being aware of what are the tactics, how cybersecurity is now, super related to disinformation and information operations in general, I think that is already helpful. But in terms of tools, I really haven't seen anything that would provide 100% safety for the government services.
Thank you. That was so fascinating. And I would like to open it up actually for really anyone who has comments or questions. So should we open it up?
Sure.
Yeah.
A question. I'm John. I'm a member of the public. I'm curious about the maze that you talked about. and the art. So could you give us some more details? I mean, what did it actually look like?
The maze was more, so back in Ukraine, it was more educational. It was called Media Literacy Maze, and it was targeting school children. So in a town on a Saturday, on Saturday morning, people would go with their families to go and see the maze. And then kids would just go through it. They can play with different photographs to see when the photograph, if it is generated, when it's real, or when it's just cut out so that you can see part of the photo and it's a completely different story. You open a second part, you see the full picture, and it completely changed your understanding of how this story was unfolding. And then when it's a bit more gamified, people tend to remember it better and it evokes some emotions. In the end of the maze, they get a certificate saying that they went through the maze and they're doing a great job. So it makes them feel good about themselves as if they accomplished something. So in the end, despite we targeted secondary school children, lots of adults were actually interested in going through the maze. And usually that's what happens. If parents bring their kids and their kids get excited, parents also want to see what gets them excited. So that's a good way to target, to reach wider population. And also it's just it's a town event. It's not something, it's not even a museum. It's just something that's out there. And if it's in the open space where people naturally tend to gather, people feel curious and they want to see what it is. But of course, it requires some collaboration with the local authorities. We need to make sure it's safe. And given that the maze was traveling through Ukrainian cities during the wartime, we had to take a lot of precautionary measures to make sure there are some shelters in the place, to make sure people, you know, if there's a rocket attack, what is the action plan for that case, which sounds surreal, but this is how it was. And despite the actual, you know, rocket attacks, people were still excited about the maze, because when you don't want to get flooded by the war news all the time. People want to have fun. And I think the maze was giving them that possibility. So I found it was really helpful. One thing that I think we could have done more is to measure the behavioral change, because if people feel excited and they get the certificate, what do they do after it? So if I were to do the maze again, I would definitely put more emphasis on this action outlet. If people get excited, we need them to commit to one single action, and then we can measure whether they stick to that commitment over the time. And that would be interesting from an academic perspective to see, you know, how we can tailor the solution so that we actually bring some behavioral change to people.
I have a question, but I don't want to, yeah, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, actually, I want to say hi, I haven't seen you. And just, I was a Jack Snyder student, in 2000, taking a class of nationalism.
Oh,
And, yeah, we've been in touch, but anyway, I do come from St. Petersburg, from Russia. I also have a mixed background, grandparents from the Ukrainian side, grandparents come from the Russian side, but okay, so 2 comments. So the first comment is that, you know, the media campaign is done under the guidance of a very well-trained security professional who is the head of the state, who has been trained in intelligence and counterintelligence, who is very well aware of how public opinion can be manipulated. And, you know, the outputs of the presidential administration, they send guidance to the ministries of the government, including the foreign ministry, including the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so on and so forth. I have a legal, logical from Russia, so I know a little bit how the ministries work. So as far as the disinformation tactics and the information tactics, that's something that was very valuable for me to understand just from this talk. But one thing I wanted to say is, I learned from Jack's class that it's a very classic us versus them situation when you have Ukraine and when you have Russia. And what happens is, during this disinformation campaign or the propaganda campaign on both sides, you mentioned the internal tactics used for the Russian populace. We're talking about a level of information and the output of the governmental channels that basically portray the image of the enemy by comparing them exactly as polar opposites to what Russians are. It's like Ukrainians are not Russians. Russians are not Ukrainian. That has been the governmental narrative since at least 2014, as far back as I can remember. But and so when we're looking at the output of the governmental agencies specifically, I mean, I have a little bit of an insight on the UN Security Council. I worked there a little bit, and I know that, for example, the Russian Foreign Ministry, the permanent mission of Russia, speaking the UN Security Council, they always portray the vision of the Russian government, and they compare it as the polar opposite to the actions of the Ukrainian government, and they say, well, you know, these guys are, you know, wreaking havoc on the Russian Belgorod territory, right? And this is like all terrorist activities, and they do this like exact opposite kind of reasoning when you're talking about, well, you have this situation and Ukrainians do the same thing, and what they do is, like, logically speaking, if you look at this way of narrating, presenting the information, you're looking at two logical fallacies. Basically, you're looking at the fallacy of attacking the straw man because they are attacking like a wrong situation by saying that the Ukrainians are to blame. So that's one fallacy. The other fallacy is basically attacking, making personal attacks on them. When you are talking about the Europeans are supporting Ukraine and they're blaming Russia, we're going to blame the Europeans for doing something that we're doing with Ukraine, but we're going to look at the national minority treatment in Romania, or we're going to look at the treatment of national minorities in France, something like that. But it's this kind of, if you look, I mean, and I've been closely observing this sort of
Could you move to a
conversation.
question?
It's a comment.
Oh, okay, could you
It's-
wrap up your comment so that we
It's
have?
really a comment
Yeah.
on something that people who work with propaganda need to understand, that it's a very cheap type of propaganda. It's not sophisticated, it's just like polar opposites. And when that is being fed to the Russian public, that is something that is unfortunately has taken over since the start of the war. I'm just like trying to expose how this is done.
I think we've seen a lot of this indeed, and one of them is whataboutism, and that usually when Russian speakers are, and even BBC invited so many Russian speakers to share their perspective of the war, which I think I'm not fully agreeing with providing a platform for that perspective, but the common thing is that when the speaker is provided with factual information on what Russia does on Ukrainian territory and it's illegal, their response would be like, what about Donbass? What about this? What about that? And they completely ignore the facts. So they divert attention of the audience and of the journalists from the initial question, and they start blaming the other side. And I think that's a tactic that I've seen a lot. And unfortunately, it worked for that journalist. I was surprised that the journalist didn't actually go back to the question and didn't demand an answer, and they actually switched their attention. And that was exactly the manipulation that they used.
It's very unsophisticated, and it's a rhetorical device that is just a rubber stamp on all the communications that go out to the world from the Russian ministries, especially at the UN, for example. It's like the same thing all over again. It's like they use the same exact rhetorical device. It's just like it's gotten old. And
Yeah,
it's
we've
about
seen it.
time people understand.
We've all seen it. If you've ever watched any media in Europe or anywhere, you see this whataboutism for many, many years.
It's like, what about
Absolutely.
you? What
Yeah.
about you? It's like, guys, there's world outside of like us and them. There's like also, Latin America and Africa,
Okay.
they have their own views.
We're gonna move on. So thank you for that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I also have one brief question. You mentioned that this program was mostly for the kids, so for the school children. So I'm just wondering if any media literacy programs were integrated in Ukrainian educational programs for the kids of different age. And another question is, how should be the difference between censorship and media literacy be explained in democracy? For example, if Ukraine, as you said, Ukrainians do see it as a direct threat and as a part of the Russian war. So for people in Europe, for example, they don't feel this threat. So how should it be properly explained that why do we need to ban this media, for example, and it's not the censorship, since Russian propaganda also uses media literacy as an instrument to say that it's censorship and it's blowing up your democracy in your countries. So.
Yeah, so on first question, there are some schools that integrate media literacy, quite a few thousand schools actually, but I wouldn't say it's a consistent effort. Let's say if you take Finland, they have media education as part of their school curriculum for over, I don't know, for up to 100 years. In Ukraine, it's relatively recent, and it was mainly driven from within by civil society, and that they pushed the Ministry of Education to make it an integrated part of the curriculum. Still not in all schools, still there's no obligation for school to have media literacy. And given that Ukraine is now grappling with more like survival related issues around education, and lots of kids are outside of Ukraine and they don't connect to the Ukrainian education system, I think they still like pay more attention to more urgent issues. Regarding your second question, that's true. Every time we say something like that, especially to people in Brussels, who work in the regulatory bodies, their first response is, well, we don't want the public to think that we manipulate their opinion, or we don't want them to think that this is censorship. We are an open, free society. But in fact, when we do media literacy promotion, we also kind of manipulate their opinion. You can call it this way. When we tailor messages around media literacy campaigns, we also pick the right words so that people feel excited about media literacy. So it's just, I think sometimes, and I start believing in it more while being in the US, we have to make important compromises. And sometimes it will be painful, but if we want to be safe, we can't really operate with the same frameworks that we operated for the last 20 years.
Sorry, there's an event.
Some intervention. So yeah, I truly believe that a lot more has to be done, and in particular on educating the publics, because usually the first reaction from the government officials is that how do we justify spending more on media literacy or on, I don't know, something related to studying adversaries' information environment to our publics, because they're suffering, they don't have the basic financial needs covered. Why do we need to spend more on information threats? And the thing is that of course, you can't do it unless the publics understand why you're doing it. So for them to understand it, you need to raise the awareness around the threats. And this awareness can be, increased through media work. And media in particular can play a huge role in explaining to the publics how information threats affect their daily decisions.
So you mentioned the problem of countering disinformation about corruption, but I want to ask the question about just handling information about corruption. So the recent Ukrainian government corruption issue arose in circumstances where the initial information about what was going on was like very unclear. It seemed like mysterious and like the New York Times couldn't figure it out. The New York Times told us, well, the Zelensky government is for some reason like preventing the anti-corruption official organization from investigating alleged corruption. And you read these stories and it's like, what is going on here? And then later on, you find out more and more information. And so just putting myself in the shoes of someone who's trying to be a truth teller on social media, like how should I, cover or give guidance to, people on social media in this kind of situation? Should I say nothing because we don't really know what the truth is? And if I'm saying nothing about it, like how will that affect, my organization's credibility? So this is a question both about how did they cover this as the fact checkers and the truth tellers that you've been telling us about. How did they deal with this problem? And it's also a question of how should they deal with the problem?
Yeah, I mean, of course, if the government is not communicating it transparently, it creates a fertile ground for everyone to speculate and especially for the adversary to take advantage of that lack of information. And it happened a few times, not just with that case, but for example, it was in the beginning of the war where a lot of Western media started publishing articles about racism in Ukraine. And it happened right in the first few months of the invasion when lots of Ukrainians were leaving the country. and some people might have experienced signs of racism. But the thing is that that picture was that whole story around racism was really one, maybe two cases that were documented. And as someone who also was traveling outside of Ukraine in the first months of the invasion, I could say I faced a lot of hatred and aggression because everyone was trying to survive. So no matter which nationality you were, you'd face similar attitudes often. But unfortunately, media amplified that narrative. And I think Russia might have done some work there, might have not. But also, if we look at, for example, the Swedish media told me that they usually try to bring voices of different communities through their reporting. So they have a very diverse ethnical, minorities in the country. So they make sure they cover all of them. But when they cover Ukraine, they dedicated 5 out of 10 stories to racism in Ukraine. And my question was, so if you cover minorities in your country, which are, I don't know, over 50% of your country, you dedicate 5 stories to them. In Ukraine, minorities are less than 2%. So why your coverage is 50% about racism? And it's just not proportional, if you know what I mean. And the thing is that Western media usually look through their own lens into Ukraine without fully understanding the context of the country. But back to your question about corruption and these allegations, I think government did not a good job. I think they should have communicated it. But of course, if there is a problem, not everyone is powerful enough to go out to the public and honestly say, yes, we have a problem and this is how we're going to fix it. And that was not done well on the Ukrainian side. I can't tell you exactly how fact checkers were handling that situation because I wasn't really in touch with anyone regarding that story. But I can tell you for sure that as a Ukrainian myself, I'm not worried about those stories being silenced and not covered enough because I have a lot of faith in the civil society. And I know if something goes wrong, Ukrainians will do everything, whatever it takes, even if it's in the worst situation, to bring accountability and to highlight that issue. And it's sometimes going to extremes. I think we need to be a bit more united in this situation when we have an external enemy. But also, it's really funny to see how Ukrainians use a lot of dark humor and dry humor to mock each other and to, criticize the leaders in the government, which I think makes us very different from authoritarian states in general. And also, Ukrainians are really self-critical, which sometimes I think is really going to extremes. But when there is an external enemy, the situation with Trump and Zelensky, Ukrainians suddenly unite really quickly and they start defending their president, even if the day before they were actually hating him in all possible comments. It is a phenomenal thing and I truly enjoy it. And that makes me feel confident that with a situation like you described, the publics will not be silenced. They will keep speaking up and they will protest and they will go out in the streets, even if there's still rocket attacks happening around the country.
Could I have just a quick follow-up? So fact-checking organizations, almost by their nature, deal in the world of, well, there's factual truth and then there's disinformation, and we're going to help you figure out what's the truth and what's disinformation. But what you just said was the important point that sometimes you don't know what the facts are. And the public truth-telling task is we need to investigate. And so should the organizations whose job is fact-checking and discriminating between information and disinformation be the same organizations that say, you know what? We don't know what the facts are. Somebody needs to investigate. Or is that just a different problem that should be handled by a different institution?
I think it's not something that they can decide either or. I think they can do both and depends on the situation. I've seen a lot of media organizations in Ukraine act as fact checkers. Many NGOs act as media and they have different arm for fact checking. So I wouldn't say this is either this or that and this organization only deals with that and this with that. I would say that they all cooperate. Sometimes you can see some interesting partnerships arising in that. And I think that's the that's really good the way it is. But what is happening now is that AI does a lot of fact checking, and Grok in particular. We were just discussing how Grok does fact checking on Twitter and on X, sorry, and that it was an interesting finding actually. It was at the business school earlier today with David Rand, and he said that they also tested fact checking with real humans, and they compared it to how Grok and Perplexity do fact checking. And for me, it was interesting to know that only in 64% of cases, fact checkers agree with each other. So even human fact checkers might have a different opinion about what's the true picture, what's not. And with Grok and Perplexity, even though there's a lot of like a stigma around Grok, it does actually a good job. I was really surprised to learn that in many cases it helped users, change their beliefs. So, I mean, there's a lot going to be happening with AI, and I think we need to look more into how LLMs can be used to do fact checking, especially in the crisis situations, which I don't think anyone has any solutions to that yet. Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name's Gil. I'm a first year MPA student. I was in last semester on democratic erosion, the AI era. And yeah, I'm curious. I know you touched a bit on like how, like kind of have to move away from just being like on the defensive. But I'm curious, like have there been successful cases of like kind of going on the offensive in this information war on like Russia's turf and like influencing public opinion in Russia? Or is it like inherently more difficult doing that, like I guess from like, a democratic state to an authoritarian state rather than vice versa? And also like related to that, like do you think the cuts to, I know in the past year there have been cuts to Radio Free Europe and all the USAID cuts, do you feel like that has also like harmed some of this effort at sort of like the West spreading its ideals and values within Russia?
I think maybe Tamar also knows some of the cases. My view is that I think there are some successful campaigns that prove there is a change in attitudes and behaviors, but they're just pockets of behavioral change. And if you can prove that someone changed their behavior because of the campaign within, let's say, 3 to 6 months, there's no guarantee that the next 6 months they're going to stick to the same behavior, because the moment you finalize the intervention, they're going to be flooded by the Kremlin sources. So for it to have an effect, I believe lots of other organizations would need to commit to doing more factual reporting inside of Russia, which is not easy, and it's completely different from how we're used to doing it in the open democratic societies. And there's so many interesting reactions that, for example, in Russia, people feel they feel threatened, right? If you follow certain media channels, you might be considered a traitor or a terrorist or whatever the government decides to name you. And I think that creates a lot of obstacles. And given that in democratic societies, we are more talking about ethical side of that, people also get worried about endangering people in Russia. So there are many things to consider, but I believe if there is a consensus in Europe as to how we do democratic messages just inside of authoritarian states, and we do it consistently, and there are budgets allocated to it, as they are now allocated to disinformation monitoring, and eventually with time there could be some change. But again, it has some red lines, and there would need to be a lot more discussions happening around it. I don't know, maybe there are some interesting cases that in other regions.
Yeah, so just to echo the challenge of knowing whether a campaign is actually effective. So we talked a lot about different efforts that Russia has been kind of placing on influencing Ukrainians, and there's many other countries Russia has been targeting. There's many countries other countries are targeting. This is a lively space, whether in war or outside of war. But the biggest challenge, and that's kind of crazy to think about, if you look at the academic research on whether this actually works, we're like tiny amount of studies that have like very narrow findings. And I think the reason is exactly what you said, that even if there is an effect and you could even measure it and know kind of whether something actually worked, the information is flowing so rapidly and so quickly that that effect might fade tomorrow. So I think that's actually a challenge of kind of studying this, but also kind of on the ground. And I tend to agree with Valeria's point that is, if you compare democratic context to authoritarian context, it's probably harder to do in authoritarian context. But it's an empirical question.
I'd like to ask a question possibly to both of you about social media. And you mentioned at the beginning in the crisis situation when Russia was using Telegram, and that was really, fascinating that they're exploiting that space. But Telegram is about also people posting, ordinary people posting and responding and talking to each other. And I did some research in Ukraine on social media, collecting some social media debates from after 2014 when people were fighting with each other in Kharkiv about different opinions about Maidan and everything that was happening politically. And one of the challenges of the research, as I'm sure you know, is like who's speaking? Is it a Russian bot? Is it a person from the city? Is it somebody from the media? Is it an influencer? What's going on here, and how do we know who's actually doing the talking? But you kind of, in a way, like depict the Ukrainians as a little bit passive recipients of the Russian disinformation at the beginning of the war. But weren't there a lot of Ukrainians who were engaging on Telegram, writing, having their opinions? And does your research or do your programs have a way to deal with that, or do you think about that, or do you just focus on like the main channel and the disinformation message that's being pushed? Because it seems to me like Telegram has this unique, the thing about it is like it's the public square. People are debating, they're talking, so it can shape opinions as well based on what people are saying to each other. And I just wonder if that's something that people who study disinformation or the programs that you are looking at in Ukraine, have thought about or, conceptualized or something.
That's an interesting point. It's true that in the conversations we usually portray Ukrainians as receivers, but not much as an active producers of information. I mean, there are the Telegram does give you an opportunity to also be a part of the conversation, which makes it more makes people feel more engaged. That is true. As I said, sometimes I don't have any research to prove what are Ukrainians' reactions, but I saw a lot of there's a lot of anecdotal evidence where Ukrainians would be actually actively saying this is not true on TikTok, also on Telegram. But again, there are also many bots. So those bots, usually you see more of them than those voices who would, call out this disinformation. What I'm saying these days is that Instagram threads is becoming more popular in the Ukrainian environment. And one of the interesting cases was the post with a Russian bot where they mispronounced the name of the Ukrainian city Lviv by using a Russian E instead of Ukrainian. And they posted a picture of a very beautiful lady saying, "Hi, I'm from Lviv." And Lviv is mispronounced. And that post had, I don't know how many thousands comments from Ukrainians calling it out and saying, "Hey, I'm from Kyiv." And like they were mocking it, saying, making fun of it. And then that post got so viral. And it made me feel happy because, when people still detect it and then also there are so many memes around Russian propaganda messages that were translated really badly, that it didn't make sense in Ukrainian. It was a really funny message that they completely misunderstood in Russian, and they tried to target Ukrainians with that. And there are so many other phrases that Ukrainians picked up, and then it has become a part of a shared history and shared memory around how lame Russian propaganda can be. So I think humor in that case does the right job in terms of resilience building and creating that shared sense of community. This is something I'm seeing a lot, and I would love to learn if there's been enough research to prove how it actually affects resilience and whether it contributes to general understanding of disinformation tactics in general.
This is so fascinating. I've seen similar dynamics in the Middle Eastern case. But I want to say that on your question on kind of how do you know who is posting, like who is the author of the message or like who's behind the campaign? Very hard to know. Like if you try to study this systematically, you have to have some methodology of like scope and conditions on like what you study. So in my most recent work, I've focused on deliberately on official channels, unofficial channels that are very clearly linked to the entity that is producing the information, or influencers that are also have many, many followers and are clearly advancing that side's messaging. But of course, there's a lot many other people that we would call like, you know, the regular social media user, or maybe a bot that looks like a regular social media user that is also producing information. And I think this is a space we study less systematically, precisely because it's just hard to know. But maybe that's where most of the information is actually coming from, if you think of volume. I don't know. This is again, sorry to say, another empirical question, but I do think that it's really hard to put kind of boundaries around, like, you know, unless you know exactly like when a campaign originates from, let's say, an agency in Russia, and you know exactly the handles that they use and exactly the networks they created. Sometimes we know that and we can study that behavior, but there's always more that we can't for sure attribute. And usually that kind of gets less attention in the research.
I think we used to do, I mean, it makes sense if you see, for example, one message by someone in the Telegram channel called Right Bank of Kiev, and then within a minute there's the same message from same bot or similar bot, exactly the same phrasing in the Telegram channel called Left Bank of Kiev. It's highly likely that it's the automated. But I think what's happening these days is that bots are capable of having unique conversations, and that is actually a big problem. And I don't see it happening as much in Ukraine. I mean, as we've been told, Russian propaganda is not as technologically advanced. I think US has enormous amount of tech capabilities that we should actually use more to protect democracies. But we don't.
You're saying we have it here, but it's
I think US is
yet.
more much more technologically advanced, and with all the capabilities in the tech field, we could have been so much more superior in the information domain. But I think Russian, if they start using bots at scale, like, you know, those bots that have the capability to have unique conversations, that will be really a big trouble, because I mean, they can have follow-up questions. You can't really see how this exact same bot can have completely different conversation elsewhere and still promoting the same narrative. So I think it makes it much harder for researchers to actually track them.
Yes.
Just a quick question on Stuart and from the public as well. I always wondered whether, like, to what extent information and disinformation is subjective rather than objective. So, for example, could there be a similar group of people in Russia who are all pretty smart and want to know the truth, who are talking about how they can combat Western disinformation, if we're talking about sending information in to change their beliefs and calling it information rather than disinformation? Or is that just not really a thing?
I mean, when we talk about sending information inside of authoritarian regimes, we're not talking about impersonation and bots and made up stories and fake stories. We're talking about factual information, highlighting the facts that the government of Russia or any other authoritarian country might not be willing to disclose because it contradicts the general narrative that they want to promote. So, I mean, I have no answer to that, if that would be a group of Russians willing to fact check Western information. I think we're getting too far into the future. I think we would need to ask Russians themselves if they would be having enough agency to mobilize and to fact check information from. I don't really have an answer to that, unfortunately.
I want to add, though, that there is, especially in war contexts where the value of information is really potentially strategically important, there is a battle of narratives. And yes, that mirror image of the sort of claims the other side is wrong, we are right, and vice versa, absolutely happens and can happen. And this is for a strategic reason. I think what Valeria was talking about is more like, you know, the asymmetry between if you actually have a ground truth and you want to shed light on that ground truth, that would be asymmetric in certain contexts. But I think that, you know, there could certainly be a group of people who say like, oh, like kind of point to the other side and say like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong for, for anything. So I think it's important to say that even though it's maybe harder or easier to do this sort of fact checking, the strategic reasons for doing that are there. And if somebody in the public would be convinced that the other side's narrative is wrong, then you have a win. So just to make that point, that there is reasons to maybe people wanting to do that. Sophia?
First of all, thanks so much for coming. This is really interesting. I'm Sophia, I'm the first year at Harriman. And I think one of the hardest parts of like dispelling disinformation and supporting media literacy, I think, is getting over the emotional response that a lot of people give. It makes sense that a lot of disinformation and propaganda that's online kind of evokes this emotional response from people that makes people really stubborn and sometimes unwilling to kind of want to learn the truth. Do you guys have more like some strategies in combating these emotional responses and trying to help people be more aware of just not falling into these traps of disinformation? Because I think that's like really the hardest things. You can show objective information, but if someone has this like emotional response, and a lot of people also don't want to feel like they are foolish and have fallen for these things. Like, are there any ways that are that you found have kind of been successful?
You want to? I'll let you go first.
I think what I found and what worked for us back in Ukraine is when you have someone who they respect telling them that truth. And usually what was happening before, people, civil society organizations, they would come up with some wonderful, brilliant training, and then they would delegate some trainer from Kiev to a region somewhere farther in Ukraine. And then this trainer would come and impose their truth on the others. And they would face a lot of skepticism because people from the local community, they don't really feel like the guy or the woman from Kiev really knows their pains. But if it's someone they already respect and trust, telling them, have you actually looked at that side of the story? It's more likely that they would actually be interested in looking at that side. Another thing is that I do my personal experiments. So I sometimes, if someone has a very far right thought that I don't really share, I usually say, that's so interesting, can you tell me more? So usually a person feels excited about someone being curious around their way of thinking, and you exercise a lot of deep listening. That's something I also learned that works well in journalism. The moment you show people the respect and the curiosity, they feel excited to share their truth. Once they shared their truth, they feel safe with you. So you start slowly nudging them and you give them a set of questions that make them think. But of course, it doesn't happen in a 1 hour conversation. It has to be regular. It has to be in a way that you show them respect, and they then eventually build trust with you. And that same thing happens with Ukrainians from the occupied territories and now relatively newly deoccupied territories. Ukrainians who were under Russian information in the Russian information ecosystem for that time, they obviously changed their beliefs. So there is a lot of discussion around how do we bring them back into the Ukrainian information space. And unfortunately, we can't really have one training and then after the training declare that Ukrainians are back. It's like a therapy in a way. We have to make them speak up. We don't have to judge them. We can't really. If we do that, if we say you're wrong, we create the defense in them, and they become less excited about even sharing what they're talking about. I know we're almost out of time. Just to add, as the bias of an academic on the table here, I think that also knowing kind of the aims behind. So if you know that your emotions are kind of used to convince you, then I think that knowledge is also power. So part of what I wish to do is to shed light on those aims and kind of explain how it works, so then we can explain to the public in a way that makes us all more aware. So I'll close here, but yeah.
So for our students in the room who would like to be doing the kind of work that you do, can they learn how to do it by taking your course?
Come take my course.
Tell us when that will be and what math requirements there are to get in the room, if any.
Yeah, so actually there's one relevant course that's currently running. It's usually in the spring semester. It's basically It's called Texas Data. It teaches students who have very minimal, it takes students who have very minimal quantitative skills but can program in R. That's a basic knowledge that is required to kind of go through all the steps one would need to have and know how to do to study like social media bots and what they are saying. And there is increasingly growing amount of tools that make it even easier to do. But we have to know in our brains how to do it well. So I'm not the type of person to just delegate everything to automated models, but you actually have to know how to do this well. So my course is one of several that are being offered at the university to give skills and tools to people who want to study these questions, because we are talking about volumes of information, and you have to know how to work with this sort of more quantitative approaches to study. But I'm happy to talk to anyone who might be interested more.
Great. Yeah, it's the future. Okay, and there's so many questions and that need to be posed and thought
Yes.
about. Yeah. I know for me, this has been a problem because I keep trying to work with the social media data and there's some limits to kind of trying to first interpret so much context. Textual knowledge is important, and then so much technical knowledge. And there's so many different kinds of questions. So I think it's really fascinating and encourage our students to delve into this area. Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been, I think, quite informative and interesting and important conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was marvelous.
Thank you for giving us the space.
Yes.
I want to take your course. Are you doing it this